Hi everyone, welcome to codeAYD. Today now making iOS apps in Swift series. We'll be continuing our creation of an interface and we'll be looking specifically at constraints. If we take our app that we've built and we run it in an iPhone XS Max, you'll see that it looks nice once it loads. Yep, so it looks quite nice here. We've got the right spacing everywhere and it looks exactly like the thing we've designed over here. I'm just going to resize mine to show you that. It looks exactly like what we've designed over here. But if I change the device to something like an iPhone 8 and I hit run and I go back to my simulator, my iPhone XS Max has stopped running, and what it's done is it's gone and it's started up a new device in the simulator. So here we go, we can see it here. It's created an iPhone 8 for me and it's going to run my app in the iPhone 8. So I'll just wait for this to finish loading. So my iPhone 8 has finished loading now and you can see my app in it, but it looks really weird. If I open up the app in the iPhone XS Max, you can see that it has nice spacing everywhere, but on the iPhone 8 this is not the same. The reason is simple, they have different screen sizes. When I make a label or anything in Xcode, it creates it based on a certain size. It doesn't scale it down for smaller device sizes. I have to do the work manually, and this is where constraints come in handy. So for example, this label here, I always want it to be on that center line. Again, if I hold it, those blue lines come up. I always want it to be on the center line, and I always want it to have some spacing on either side. So I can actually do this with constraints. You might have noticed by now, these 4 buttons down the bottom here, if I click them, I can have a look at what they do. So this one adds new constraints. Select my label. You have to select a label or whatever you're trying to put constraints on. You have to select that before you go down here. I can update my constraints and my views, and I can see the different alignments down here. What I want to do with this one is I wanted to keep it in the center of my screen. So if I click this second option here, I want to say that I want to center it horizontally in the container. And there you go. Now it will always be centered there. So if I run my app again in the iPhone 8, there you go. So you can see that it's now centered, but it is for some reason sticking up to the top of the screen. It has the spacing I want on the sides. Probably I want this red part to be a little bigger, but it's not centering up and down ways. And that's because of constraints. We haven't completely set up constraints yet. I need to tell it the spacing I want from my label to this little notch up here, or what's called the safe area. So if I click on the hierarchy over here, safe area, you can see this rectangle. That is where you're allowed to build inside of. You never want to build your app outside of there. For example, I don't want to go and start putting elements up here because they'll get hidden behind the notch, and I don't want to put elements down here because they'll be hidden behind here. The iPhone 8 we know does not have a notch. So if I view this instead of a XS Max, I can change my device. If I view it as an iPhone 8, you see it has no notch. So the safe area is everywhere except the status bar. Again, we don't want to put elements in the status bar. But if we build in the safe area, we have no problem. Anything that you drag on by default will be in the safe area unless you move it. So I want to say that I want this label to be a certain distance away from the top of my safe area. To do that, I can go to the menu down here and I can add a new constraint. I want to add a constraint above it, so I click this button, pretending this is my view down here, that little black square, and I want to say that I want 75 pixels of space above it, and I'm going to add that constraint. There you go. You can see this little, when I click my label, you can see this little thing here, and I can see it in my attribute inspector over here, and it's a constant of 75, so it will always be 75 away from the top. If I run that again in the iPhone 8 simulator, then you'll be able to see it. And now it's not sticking to the top. Good news, it's 75 pixels away from the top. But we need to do this with all of our labels and all of our views, because you can see this view at the bottom is not centered, nor is the word screen, and nor is our description or our name. So what I want to do is I want to start working with constraints. For example, I prefer when this label has a bit more space to it, and once it's centered again. So I prefer that it has a bit more space to its width. In order to do that, I want to go down to this width, to this new constraints inspector, and I want to click the width option. I'm going to set mine to be 290. I'm happy with that. And I add the constraint, and you'll see it there. But you'll also see that in this warnings panel at the top, I get a warning. It opens it down here. And the one I'm mostly interested in is this one down here, saying width is 290. Fixed width constraints may cause clipping. What does that mean? It's talking about this constraint here. What it means is that if I convert my app into other languages, or if the text value of this label ever changes, so for example, something about me you don't know, if I was to change it like that, you see it truncates. Normally the button would like to expand. If I didn't have this width constraint, you'd see it would expand. But because I have this width constraint, it has to truncate. It puts these 3 dots, and it doesn't want to do this. So what I need to do is I need to say that the width, if I click that constraint, you'll see it in the attribute inspector. Instead of saying it's equal to 290 pixels, I'm going to say it's greater than or equal to 290 pixels. So that if I make the label big, it will be there. And if I take some text out, so it only says something about me, there you go, it's like that. If I change the text to be something like the word hi, you'll see that it's like that. It has to be greater than or equal to 290 for the width always. Those are called complex constraints, and there's really a lot of things you can do with them. They're pretty handy for things like localizing your app, which means putting it in other languages. And we'll get more into width constraints later on when it comes to text. But you can see that when I click this button up here for my warnings, it opens up all these on the side. You can see that I've got a lot of warnings saying views without any layout constraints may clip their content or overlap other views. And you can expand that and see that there. Also, I have this yellow arrow on top of my view controller scene, and it says the same thing. All it means is that I need to give constraints not only for this view, the blue constraints I've set up, but this view, which has no constraints, I need to give it constraints. So we need to give constraints to everything. Now for this view here, it's a bit of an interesting one with constraints. If I wanted to, I could set it to have constraints above it and on the left of it, so it looks like that. And I could do the same with this one here, and you see that it's smart and it creates constraints relative to the thing next to it. So this one's, if I click it, this one is to the leading edge of the safe area and the leading edge of my name. So the leading edge is the front edge, and the leading edge of the safe area, which I showed you before, that safe area. I can change those if I like as well, by just changing what it constrains to, but I'm happy with how it set it up. If I do this and I was to run it on a big device, like an iPad Pro for example, I'll go with a 10.5 inch. If I go back to my simulator and it loads up the iPad, you'll see that the constraints aren't exactly as good as we thought they would be. So my iPad's loaded here, and you can see that the something about me label is centered just as I like, but the name is all the way out over here, and that's because I set the left constraint of the name to be a fixed distance there. But I actually want the name to be in line with this something about me label over here. So if I go to my name and I remove those constraints we set up, which I can do down here, I can say clear constraints for the selected views. I don't want to do it for all the views because that'll get rid of the ones over here. I just want to do it for the selected views. So I'll clear those constraints, and now we see there's still constraints here, there's still a constraint on top, but there's no constraints here. I want to select this one, and I want to hold command and select this one here, and I want to go to here, and I want to align the leading edges of them. So if I do that, you'll see that now they're always going to be in line, which is perfect. Then I want to give it the constraint for the, make sure I'm only selecting one element, not two elements. And I want to give it the constraint for the above, the height above it. So I tick that one, and I add that one constraint. Now you can see that it's like that, and I'll fix up this constraint as well. For the left constraint, I want it to be about 20 pixels, and I want to add that. And there you go. Now when I run it again on my iPad, you'll be able to see that it actually looks exactly how I wanted it. There you go. So name is in line with the something about me label. So these three labels which have constraints look really nice. The other ones, they don't look very nice yet, So we'll just go through and we'll quickly add all the constraints. You might be asking by now, wow, this seems quite a complex and time-consuming task. It's not very complex, but it is quite time-consuming. But trust me, constraints now will save you heaps of time later on, and they make your app look good, because I have 3 different devices here that are all running my app, and they all look really good. So let's keep doing this. The description, this one, the screen label, and my big view, they're all going to have, and I'm going to select the name as well. Those ones, we're going to align the leading edges, and we're going to center them all horizontally in the container. Add those constraints. Oh, not quite what I wanted there. So if I just undo those constraints that I added by doing Command Z, then we'll see why this is happening. So if I take my views, here we are. So I want to center them all horizontally in the container, and I want to make sure that the width of each of my elements, actually we'll do them individually. So the width of this element, I want it to be as big as possible, but I don't want the width to expand out to here where you can't see it. In other words, I would never want the width to really exceed that much here. To do that, I'm just going to add this right constraint. So 16 sounds good, and I'll just put the same on this side. You see it was negative before because it's currently out there. So if I do that, there you go. And it's red, some of my lines, and you'll see that this arrow here is also red. The reason that those are red is because it doesn't know where to put them. There's no constraint for the Y position. In other words, it knows where they are horizontally, but not vertically. So I'm just going to add those constraints. Description, I'm going to give it one above. And now those lines are blue, not red. Red lines are bad, we don't want those. Like that. Like that. And for this view down here, it doesn't really know what it's doing, so I'll just move it into place. I'm not happy with the constraints for this view, so I just want to go clear constraints for the selected view. There we go. And I want to add a bottom constraint, but I also want to add a width constraint. I think I'll go 330 for that one. And I want to center it horizontally, but it's still complaining. It has a red constraint here. And if we see why that's happening, it's a Y position or height that it's complaining about. And that's true, we haven't set a height for our view. So let's go height 190. There you go, all the constraints are blue. Now, the label within this view also needs constraints. And as I click here, you'll see it highlight. So if I'm not highlighting anything and I hit an error, you'll see that it selected the view over here. As I hover over there, it selected the label over here. So that means I need to add constraints for the label. But I don't add constraints for the label based on the entire screen. I add constraints for the label based on the view that it's in. So I want it to be centered horizontally and vertically based on the view that it's in. And there you go, you can see that looks nice. We still have one more error, which is the trailing constraint for Aiden. So it's pretty much saying it doesn't know where this part here ends. That's trailing. So we have the top edge, the bottom edge, the leading edge, and the trailing edge. It doesn't know where the trailing edge finishes. I want my trailing edge to be aligned with the end of this label up here. So let's align the trailing edges. And it wasn't happy with that. Why is this? Well, we see we have horizontal hugging priorities, and it's a bit confused with what's going on here. Hugging priorities is pretty much just saying it doesn't know how to render this view up here. For example, is it supposed to be like this, where that aligns, there's a distance here, and that aligns, or is it supposed to be like this, where that aligns, then there's a fixed distance here, and then that aligns? It doesn't know how to render it, and that's because of a hugging priority. This one, we need to say, wants to be compact, and this one wants to expand. To do that, we're going to click on that label, and we're going to go to our sizing inspector, and for the hugging priority, we want this thing to be 252. I can also just select them here, so I can make it high if I like. And what that means is that now ours are all blue. You see there's no more errors. What it means is that this thing wants to be as compact as it possibly can for the width, and this thing wants to be as open and free as it possibly can for the width. They have to be different. So my values here for the hugging priority is 750, and my value for the hugging priority here is 250. I can just change that if I like. They can't both be the same, so if I make them both 750, it'll be confused and it'll put all these errors back here. I'm going to undo that. What it's saying is that these two need to be different. They can't both say, I want to be compact, because that doesn't make any sense. In order for them both to be compact, they'd be like this, and then we'd be breaking the rule of the constraint we've set up. In order to keep the rules of the constraints we've set up, we give it the hugging priority, and we set them all. We see I have this orange line here, and that means that the constraint is telling it to be here, but the view's not actually there. So if ever you have orange lines, you want to select the view. I hit Command Option equals, and it'll move it back. There's a whole lot of neat tricks in Xcode like that, which we'll learn throughout the course as well. So let's go through these again and see what the problem is. Fix leading and trailing constraint with a center constraint equals clipping. We won't go too much into this anymore because we've spent a lot of time with constraints, but pretty much it's saying that there's a localization issue. That just means if we translate it into other languages, we might have problems. These are yellow warnings. Red is errors, but yellow is warnings. The app won't run with red errors, but it will run with yellow warnings. It's just advising you of things you might encounter later on, different issues. We're going to continue building the app, so I'm going to hit build or run, and you'll see it work nicely on the iPad. There you go, perfect. This thing isn't how I wanted it, so I'm just going to change that so that it has a maximum width of about 500, and I'm going to say that the width is less than or equal to 500. I also then need to say that these constraints on the side are greater than or equal to that distance there. There you go. And I also want to make sure that the text is centered. And now I'll run it again on my iPad. So yes, constraints can be a bit annoying, but it's really handy to have, especially if you're going to have apps that are on iPhone and on iPad. So there you go, you see it looks nice there. I'll rerun it on my different iPhones. XS Max, let's build. And once that's done, I'll change it for the iPhone 8 as well. You see on the XS Max, it looks nice. So it looks nice on the iPad, it looks nice on the XS Max, and also looks nice on the iPhone 8. So good job, we've done constraints, and you now know how constraints work. There you go. The main thing to remember with constraints is that they might get confusing sometimes, but don't panic and don't freak out. There's always solutions, and normally most of the time it's just a silly little issue. So that's constraints, and you'll see we'll go more in depth with constraints as we start to add different elements later on. But that's all.